From New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, this is Democracy Now!
The Postal Service is a joke.
What would happen to this country if the Postal Service went out of business?
If the post office were allowed to die, and with this COVID pandemic and its economic impact on the Postal Service, if Congress doesn't step up and the people ensure that Congress steps up, the post office could die.
President Trump lashes out at the U.S. Postal Service as the pandemic brings it to the brink of collapse, while more Americans than ever are relying on the mail. We'll look at the crisis facing the Postal Service with American Postal Workers Union President Mark Dimmonstein. We'll also look at how attacks on the Postal Service could also threaten efforts to vote by mail as people are under orders to stay home. Then we look at the impact of the pandemic on schools, universities, students, parents, teachers, and professors, and who's at the table to shape what happens next.
If you're going to consolidate schools, if you're going to start moving teachers around, if you're going to start coming up with like cute experimental teaching techniques, we need to have folks from those communities at the table talking about what will and will not work up front, and not have the billionaires come rush in with a checkbook and say, hey, I've got another experiment I want to try.
We'll speak with education scholar, Cornell professor Noliwe Rooks, author of Cutting School Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. An international aid group is warning as many as 1 billion people worldwide could become infected with the novel coronavirus unless urgent measures are taken to stop its spread. The finding by the International Rescue Committee, based on UN data, came as the global death toll from the pandemic topped 217,000. In the United States, over 58,300 people have died from COVID-19, more than the number of U.S. troops killed in the Vietnam War. Officially, the U.S. has confirmed over 1 million cases of novel coronavirus, but that figure is just a fraction of the number of U.S. residents believed to have been infected. The U.S. accounts for 1/4 of all reported COVID-19 deaths worldwide and 1/3 of the confirmed cases. Top infectious disease scientist Dr. Anthony Fauci Tuesday warned states not to reopen businesses prematurely and said the United States will likely face a resurgence of COVID-19 in the fall. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom Tuesday outlined plans for a phased reopening of the economy, saying some businesses at lower risk for spreading coronavirus might be weeks away from reopening.
I want to make this clear. We believe we are weeks, not months away from making meaningful modifications to that indicator and in this space.
Here in New York, police broke up a gathering of hundreds of people Tuesday who ignored social distancing rules as they gathered for the Brooklyn funeral of a rabbi who reportedly died of the coronavirus infection. New York reported 335 coronavirus-related deaths Tuesday, its lowest single-day death toll in a month. President Trump Tuesday invoked the Defense Production Act to order meat-packing plants around the United States to remain open. Trump's executive order comes as U.S. beef, pork, and poultry processing plants are linked to areas with the highest rates of coronavirus transmission in the country. President Trump's order declaring meat plants critical infrastructure came on Workers' Memorial Day, an international day of remembrance and action for workers killed or disabled on the job. At least 20 meatpacking workers have died from COVID-19. Thousands have fallen ill from the disease. Unions say President Trump's order fails to require on-the-job safety measures that will prevent further illness and death. In a statement, Stuart Applebaum, president of the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Union, said, quote, "We only wish that this administration cared as much about the lives of working people as it does about meat, pork, and poultry products." This comes as some states, including Iowa and Texas, are warning workers they'll lose unemployment benefits if they refuse to return to the job when recalled after a layoff or furlough, even if those workers are concerned about contracting the coronavirus on the job. A new survey by the Economic Policy Institute finds millions of U.S. workers who've lost their jobs have been unable to file for unemployment benefits, with state agencies unable to keep up with the sheer volume of new claims. This comes as the official U.S. unemployment rate is set to reach 16% or higher this month, levels not seen since the Great Depression. In Puerto Rico, San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz says residents of the U.S. territory have yet to receive promised relief during an island-wide coronavirus lockdown. She spoke with MSNBC Saturday.
No one in Puerto Rico has received the $1,200 from the federal government. We're having problems with the local $500 that the governor said that was going to distribute. There's more than 130,000 unemployment requests that have not been filled. The same thing with people getting food stamps.
Workers at some of the biggest corporations in the United States are planning an unprecedented wave of strikes on May 1st, International Workers' Day. Employees of Amazon, Whole Foods, Walmart, FedEx, Target, and Instacart will walk off the job demanding compensation for unpaid time off work, hazard pay, sick leave, personal protective equipment, and cleaning supplies at workplaces. Many of the workers are part of a growing coalition that will join a May 1st People's Strike launched by worker cooperatives in Mississippi. This is Kali Akuno, co-director of Cooperation Jackson.
We're asking everybody to start with these basics. No work, no shopping, no rent, no mortgage, no school, no borders, no prisons, right? Let's all take joint action together.
Tenants around the U.S. are organizing rent strikes as rent comes due on May Day for millions of newly unemployed workers. And some homeowners are planning to withhold mortgage payments. New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is calling on state and federal officials to cancel housing payments nationwide during the pandemic.
People can't pay. You cannot coerce someone into doing something that they cannot do. There is no money in the bank. People need to feed their kids. We cannot be evicting. We need to be making sure that we are passing policy that allows people to stay in their homes.
Criticism is growing over a new government program that was supposed to help small business owners receive low-interest loans to stay afloat during the economic crisis. The New York Times recently revealed more than 200 publicly traded companies received over $750 million in small business loans before the initial funding ran out. The Intercept reports many of the biggest beneficiaries have been major Trump donors, including the owners of the Ritz-Carlton and St. Thomas. Meanwhile, the Center for Responsible Lending is estimating up to 90% of businesses owned by people of color have been or will likely be shut out of the Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program. A handful of large companies who benefited from the small business loan program have agreed to return the loans after facing public backlash. The list includes the Los Angeles Lakers, Potbelly, and Shake Shack. The House of Representatives has abruptly canceled plans to reconvene on May 4th after the Capitol physician warned Washington, D.C. remains a coronavirus hotspot, with the rate of infections continuing to rise. The decision threatens to further delay work on a massive new coronavirus relief bill. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, meanwhile, says the Senate will convene on Monday as scheduled. McConnell says he wants the next coronavirus stimulus bill to include liability protections for companies whose workers become ill or die after they're ordered back to the job when states reopen their economies. Vice President Mike Pence, who leads the White House coronavirus task force, refused to wear a mask Tuesday as he met with doctors and patients at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. After the tour, Pence was asked by reporters why he violated the Mayo Clinic policy requiring everyone in the hospital wear a face covering or mask.
Let me say, as Vice President of the United States, I'm tested for the coronavirus on a regular basis, and everyone who is around me is tested for the coronavirus. And since I don't have the coronavirus, I thought it'd be a good opportunity for me to be here, to be able to speak to these researchers, these incredible healthcare personnel, and look them in the eye and say thank you.
On Tuesday, the Mayo Clinic tweeted it had informed Vice President Pence of the masking policy prior to his arrival. Later in the day, the tweet was deleted without explanation. The Associated Press reports riots are breaking out inside juvenile jails across the U.S., and some youths have attempted to escape as coronavirus cases mount. One teenager imprisoned at the Bridge City facility near New Orleans described a SWAT team pepper spraying a group of children who'd kicked down their cell doors. Criminal justice and children rights advocates are demanding youths be allowed to serve the remainder of their time at home amidst the pandemic. In New Jersey, The Intercept reports nearly 30 imprisoned people have died of COVID-19. Only 184 New Jersey prisoners have been tested for the virus, less than 1% of New Jersey's incarcerated population. In Arizona, families and allies of incarcerated women held a car rally and prayer vigil outside Perryville Prison Sunday, continuing demands for the release of imprisoned people as COVID-19 rapidly spreads through Arizona jails. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has confirmed the first COVID-19 death of a female prisoner. Andrea Circlebear had given birth to her child while on a ventilator 4 weeks prior. She'd been transferred from a jail in South Dakota to Texas. Circlebear was a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and was 30 years old. In related news, an Iranian scientist imprisoned in a U.S. immigration jail who for weeks has been pleading for his freedom has contracted COVID-19. Dr. Sarush Askari often spoke about his fears of coronavirus spreading inside crowded immigration and customs enforcement jails and about the unsanitary and inhumane conditions inside the Wynn Correctional Center at Louisiana, where he's being held. Attorneys and advocates are raising concerns for the due process of immigrant children as the Trump administration continues deportation hearings for unaccompanied minors during the pandemic. Due to social distancing guidelines, judges appear in a TV screen or connect via telephone. There are no attorneys physically present. Public universities in California are issuing emergency grants to students under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA, as they cope with the financial devastation triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. This comes as over 24 Democratic Congress members are condemning Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's exclusion of college students with DACA from receiving coronavirus emergency federal aid to cover expenses like food, housing, and childcare. In related news, ProPublica reports internal emails show Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has access to a database containing the personal information of DACA recipients, despite promises from the Trump administration that information from DACA applications would not be sent to deportation agents. In Brazil, the total number of confirmed COVID-19 deaths has surpassed the death toll figure the World Health Organization is reporting for China. On Tuesday, the Brazilian Health Ministry reported over 470 more deaths than the previous day, bringing the total to just over 5,000. Meanwhile, Brazil's Supreme Court has given the green light to an investigation of alleged corruption and obstruction of justice by far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. The High Court's decision comes after former Justice Minister Sergio Moro resigned on Friday, accusing Bolsonaro of illegally firing the federal police chief who was at the time investigating Bolsonaro's political allies and 2 of his sons. On Tuesday, Bolsonaro appointed a family friend as the new federal police chief. The World Health Organization says it's preparing to slash humanitarian aid to Yemen's healthcare system by as much as 80% after the Trump administration cut off funding to the UN global health body. Some 24 million people in Yemen, about 80% of the population, are reliant on humanitarian aid. Millions of Yemenis are on the brink of starvation. Yemen, which has been devastated by the U.S.-backed Saudi-led military bombing campaign since 2015, already has an ongoing cholera epidemic. It confirmed its first coronavirus case on April 10th. In Lebanon, massive protests continued in Beirut and cities across Lebanon for a second consecutive night Tuesday as people are angered by the deteriorating economy and alarming food shortages during the pandemic.
We are daily workers. If we work, we eat. If we don't work, we don't eat. May God change the situation for the better.
The largest and most violent protest was reported in Tripoli, Lebanon, triggered by the death of a 26-year-old man who was reportedly shot by the Lebanese army during a protest the previous night. Protesters in Tripoli torched several banks in response as clashes with soldiers continued into the early hours of Wednesday. A warning to our viewers, the next story contains disturbing footage. Video has gone viral of a white police officer in Northern California repeatedly punching a 14-year-old African-American boy who was laying on the ground. The Rancho Cordova officer stopped the boy after he allegedly purchased a cigar from an adult. A video of the incident has been viewed over 2 million times online. In climate news, parts of the U.S. Southwest are poised to shatter April heat records, with Las Vegas expected to reach triple digits today for the first time ever before May 1st. Highs in Phoenix could reach 106 degrees Fahrenheit, also a record. In Russia, new wildfires have erupted in central Siberia, with temperatures soaring by as much as 36 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says 2020 is on track to become the hottest year ever recorded, topping 2016. In Alberta, Canada, severe flooding on the Athabasca River has submerged homes and buildings in the city of Fort McMurray, forcing the evacuation of 13,000 people despite the coronavirus lockdown. With local hotels nearing capacity, local officials are housing some evacuees in nearby work camps for tar sands oil workers, camps that have been left idled by historically low oil prices and the coronavirus pandemic. A group of climate scientists and environmentalists, including filmmaker Josh Fox and Professor Michael Mann, are calling for a new movie executive produced by Michael Moore to be taken offline, claiming it's dangerous, misleading, and destructive, unquote. The film, Planet of the Humans, describes renewable energies like wind and solar as useless and accuses the environmental movement of selling out to corporate America. Michael Moore and the film's director, Jeff Gibbs, have described the documentary as a, quote, full frontal assault on our sacred cows, unquote. The online film website Films for Action briefly took down the documentary, claiming it was, quote, full of misinformation, but later added it back to its site with a lengthy note. The author and activist Naomi Klein recently tweeted, quote, it's truly demoralizing how much damage this film has done at a moment when many are ready for deep change. There are important critiques of an environmentalism that refuses to reckon with unlimited consumption and growth, but this film ain't it, Naomi Klein tweeted. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, what's happening to the U.S. Post Office during the pandemic? We'll be speaking with the head of the U.S. Postal Service Workers Union, and then we're going to look at education in America under coronavirus. Stay with us.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
We Shall Overcome, sung virtually by Alabama's Oakland University Aeolians during their 2020 virtual alumni homecoming. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York City with my co-host Juan Gonzalez, joining us from his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. More than 6,400 people have now died from coronavirus-related complications in New Jersey. At least, well, close to 114,000 cases of COVID-19 have been reported, second only to New York. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, wishing your family very well in these very difficult times. We're going to turn right now to the post office. We look at the devastating impact the coronavirus has had on the U.S. Postal Service, which may be on the brink of collapse. This at a time when more people than ever are relying on the mail. The nation's mail service faces steep losses in revenue, warns it may not survive through summer without major federal assistance. But President Trump and his administration have repeatedly rejected attempts to bail out the Postal Service, blocking its inclusion in the $2.3 trillion stimulus bill. Trump lashed out at USPS on Friday.
The Postal Service is a joke because they're handing out packages for Amazon and other internet companies, and every time they bring a package, they lose money on it. The post office, if they raise the price of a package by approximately 4 times, it'd be a whole new ball game. But they don't want to raise because they don't want to insult Amazon, and they don't want to insult other companies, perhaps, that they like. The post office should raise the price of the packages to the companies, not to the people, to the companies. And if they did that, it would be a whole different story.
The Washington Post called Trump's claim that the USPS loses money on every package it delivers for e-commerce merchants baseless. Later that day, Trump tweeted, quote, "I will never let our post office fail. It's been mismanaged for years, especially since the advent of the internet and modern-day technology. The people that work there are great, and we're going to keep them happy, healthy, and well," Trump tweeted. At least 30 Postal Service workers have died from COVID-19. The U.S. Post Office has reported more than 1,200 confirmed cases of the virus. Workers report a lack of protective gear. Earlier this month, Senator Bernie Sanders discussed the crisis confronting the Postal Service with American Postal Workers Union President Mark Dimmonstein.
I understand that the Postmaster General has said that the Postal Service will be running out of money in a few months. The Postal Service has been dealing with long-term financial problems. What would happen to this country if the Postal Service went out of business?
If the post office were allowed to die, and with this COVID pandemic and its economic impact on the Postal Service, if Congress doesn't step up and the people ensured that Congress steps up, the post office could die. It runs on no taxpayer dollars. It runs on revenue.
I'll say that again, because I think most people don't know that.
The post office.
Most people think that it's a government agency. Explain where the revenue comes from that sustains the Postal Service.
It's a quasi-independent government agency that only runs on revenue from postage and postal services. No taxpayer dollars. And that revenue has to be able to maintain the delivery to 160 million addresses, the retail units all over the country, often the anchor of communities, whether it's rural or urban.
This comes as the attack on the U.S. Postal Service also poses a massive threat to the upcoming November presidential election. Well, for more, we are joined by the American Postal Workers Union President, Mark Dimmonstein. Welcome to Democracy Now! First and foremost, can you talk about the health of the workers in the U.S. Postal Service around this country, what they're confronting now? Here in New York, we see post offices closed, mail's not delivered for weeks. I talked to a Postal Service worker who was walking down the street. He was saying that they are devastated.
Well, first, greetings. Thank you so much for having us on, Amy. Look, it's a challenging and dangerous time. Postal workers are essential frontline workers. We salute all the frontline workers, grocery store workers, healthcare personnel, transit workers, firefighters, and so on. These are tough times. The Postal Service and the postal employees, proud postal employees, are doing the best we can to move the mail of the people of the country, get vital supplies, life-saving medicines, all sorts of important information. And the mission of the post office is to bind the country together, the public postal service. So obviously there's going to be gaps in the mail service. There's workers who are unable to come to work because of sickness, because of quarantine, because of deep concerns and fears. And we have a liberal leave policy that helps protect the workers, protect themselves. But on the whole, the post office is still able to serve even in these very difficult times. And the pandemic, you know, the post office and postal workers are often taken for granted. We've been here since a year before the country was founded. It's something that's always there. But in this time of pandemic, I think there is a great appreciation for what postal workers are doing. We have had deaths. It's up to, unfortunately, 45. Many people have been sickened. Many people have been quarantined. And yet the proud postal workers are still coming to work when they can and serving the American people the best we can.
Well, Mark Dimmerstein, I wanted to ask you, we constantly hear these reports that the Postal Service is is running huge deficits every year. But could you talk about how a previous reform that required the Postal Service to prepay all of these retirement benefits for years, what the impact that has had, the decision by Congress to impose that restriction on the Postal Service, what that has, the impact that has had on the bottom line?
Well, it definitely had an impact on the bottom line, and I can share that briefly. But I do want to differentiate some of the historical problems and the ongoing problems with the COVID pandemic economic crisis and how that's affecting the post office. But as a little background, in 2006, Congress passed a law called the Postal Accountability Enhancement Act. And they did something to the Public Postal Service that no other government agency and no other private company has ever had to do. And it's just too onerous. They forced the post office to pay 75 years into the future, and within a 10-year period, 75 years into the future, retiree health benefits. So that's for workers that not only did not work at the post office yet, but weren't even born yet. And that's where so much of the news stories each year about the Postal Service being in debt came from. It was a manufactured, on-paper crisis. The reality is, if you took out that pre-funding mandate, the post office actually did quite well. The post office is not set up as a business. It's not set up to pack billions of dollars in the bank and enrich shareholders or CEOs. It's set up to serve the people of the country, and it was doing that well, even with the challenges. But if I can fast forward to now, I think it's important to separate out some of the ongoing problems, some of the changing mail habits, some of the opportunities that the post office has to bring in new revenue, like postal banking and so on. But talk about what's really happening right now, because whatever happened in 2006, even if it didn't happen, the COVID pandemic is having a huge, devastating, dire impact on postal revenue. As the lead-in talked about, there's no taxpayer dollars that goes into the post office. It runs strictly on the revenue of postal and postal products. And that revenue has to be able to be enough to carry out the mission of what we call the universal service mandate. Every address, every person, no matter who we are and where we live, a great small d democratic right. Getting mail, packages, 6 days a week now, sometimes 7. And what's happened in this pandemic, and it's economic devastation throughout the entire country and world. But what's happened specifically to the Postal Service is the mail has precipitously dropped off. Just think about it. What restaurant is sending coupons through the mail? What small business is saying, come to my business, we have a sale going on? Well, the business is closed. Even grandpa like me can't go out and buy the birthday card for the grandkids and put it in the mail because the store is closed or we're sheltered at home. So it's had a huge impact. And what's happening is a lot of the mail, the marketing mail, for example, has dropped off almost 50%. And that's going to continue to happen. Packages are up some, but how long is that going to last when 25 million people and more to come are unemployed? So what's happening is there's a fork in the road. The Postal Service will actually run out of money, whether it's this summer, whether it's early fall. The revenue just isn't there, strictly based on COVID. So what we've asked, and it's not just the we of the postal unions, the Postal Board of Governors, which sets policy, which is a majority Republican board right now, has unanimously asked for robust relief, not a bailout. This is for the people of the country. This doesn't go into any shareholders, any CEOs. But to make up that lost revenue so the post office can weather this crisis and still, at the same time, serve the people of the country, both in ordinary times and in this time of crisis. So it's serious, it's real, and again, it's very focused on the COVID pandemic economic impact.
And in addition to the potential or the possibility of additional help as a result of COVID from Congress, what about these? Could you talk a little bit more about these proposals, reformed ways for new possible reforms for new revenues for the post office? Specifically, this whole issue of banking, or what other people call Federal Reserve accounts that would be used through individual post offices?
Look, the post office is a wonderful national treasure in every community, from the most remote rural portions of the country to the most densely populated urban centers and neighborhoods. And as such, and again, its mission is to bind the people together. So there's so much more that the post office can do. It already does a certain amount of financial services. It could do a lot more. It even basic paycheck cashing, ATMs and postal service, money transfers. All of that would be a counter to this predatory payday lending, check cashing industry. There's tens of millions of people that are either unbanked or underbanked, meaning that they have no bank account at all, or they end up in this, what they call this alternative, we call it the loan sharking predatory industry. So there are opportunities there to serve the people. It would bring in revenue. Postal workers are eager to perform those kind of things. There could be all sorts of licensing. There could be internet access. There could be copying services. There's all sorts of things that the post office can do and should do. But in order to get there, we have to make sure that we have a public postal service. And that now is really up for grabs, because clearly we have an administration that would like to, and it's clear, they have an agenda. They would like to sell the public postal service off to private corporations, privatize it, and turn what's the service of the people into, and everybody has the same equal access to, turn it into a profit-making entity where whether people get mail service or not, and at what cost, and at what kind of surcharges would depend on whether somebody can make a quick dollar. And again, the post office is set up on a nonprofit basis to serve every single person. So this administration has an agenda, and they're shamefully using this crisis to carry it out rather than set policy. I mean, here you had a incentive package of $2.2 trillion. The corporations got $500 billion. The Postal Board of Governors asked for $25 billion of that $500 billion.
Mark, I wanted to ask you also, we just have a little bit of time left, but I wanted to ask you about this this allegation of President Trump that Amazon is getting sweetheart deals from the Postal Service, and also the possibilities he's raising about giving access to Americans' mailboxes for the private carrier industry?
Well, look, every agency with authority, the Postal Regulatory Commission and others, has debunked that myth that the Postal Service is losing money on Amazon and other packages. It just isn't true. And for a president of the United States to tell the people of this country and the postal workers who are on the front lines that the post office is a joke, something that belongs to everybody in this country, it belongs to the people. That is the absolute insult of insults. And it's not a laughing matter to the people of the country, the veterans that rely on their medicines to come from VA. The Postal Service in normal times delivers 1.2 billion packages of medicine and so on. So it's, and I'm sorry, I forgot your second part of that question. If you could say it again.
And also the possibility of bringing in private carriers to deliver in regular post office boxes.
Well, look, our mailbox is an extension of our living room. It's part of our home. It's private. Nobody can walk through our front door nobody now has access to that mailbox. It's the last, really, it's the last holdout of true private communications. The internet's not, Facebook is not, tweeting is not, and so on. So that's what's called the sanctity of the mail. And if the post office was to let die by this administration, we don't think that the people of the country are going to put up with that. They're not going to let it be stolen. But if it were to die, part of what would die with it is that right to privacy and the right to what we call the sanctity of the mail. So that's an absurd idea, and we don't think the people of the country are going to buy that idea. But again, we're not going to have these debates if we don't call Congress, if we don't write Congress, if we don't email Congress, if we don't get and sign all the petitions going around. The listeners can go to apwu.org. There are petitions there demanding that Congress step up and do the right thing.
I wanted to ask you about the disproportionate impact that this threat against the post office has. Actor and activist Danny Glover wrote a piece last year in USA Today, headlined, "My Parents Proudly Work for the U.S. Postal Service, Don't Destroy It." In it, he wrote, "For black families like mine, the Postal Service has long been one of the few reliable paths to the middle class. Today, the Postal Service remains a critical source of good jobs for African Americans. Black employees make up 28.6% of the postal workforce, more than double their share of the U.S. population." So if you can talk about this, and then I want to ask you about mail at home.
Well, we are very proud that the Postal Service is such a diverse workforce. How many workers really truly have equal pay for equal work, fair hiring practices, and so on? And because of our union contracts, we have equal pay for equal work. And the postal clerks, the people that you see when you go to a post office and buy stamps and bring packages and so on, the postal clerks are now over 50% women, equal pay for equal work. As you mentioned, it has been a wonderful opportunity for many of the African-American workers, Asian workers, Latino workers, and white workers. And we're all in it together. Danny Glover, activist actor Danny Glover, is very clear that without the opportunity that his parents had, and they helped make that opportunity, they were union activists themselves. It wasn't always a good job. It was fought for. He's very clear that the opportunities he had in life were largely based on his parents' opportunity to make a decent living and give their family the opportunity and path that he was able to take. So it's that's something
President Trump, before we end, talking about mail-in voting.
You get thousands and thousands of people sitting in somebody's living room signing ballots all over the place. No, I think that mail-in voting is a terrible thing. I think if you vote, you should go. And even the concept of early voting is not the greatest because a lot of things happen, but it's okay. But you should go and you should vote. I think you should go and you should vote. You look at what they do, where they grab thousands of mail-in ballots and they dump it. I'll tell you what, and I don't have to tell you, you can look at the statistics. There's a lot of dishonesty going along with mail-in voting.
Go on to ask him, didn't you mail-in vote, which he did in Florida. But Mark Dimmonstein, let's talk about this. In the time of the coronavirus pandemic, I mean, we see what happened in Wisconsin, the fiasco around voting when people were afraid to go out to vote. The issue of mail-in voting, increasingly significant in this critical election year. How is it threatened? What does this mean?
Well, look. We're talking now about basic access to the ballot box and defense of our cherished and hard-fought right to vote. And the reality is the post office is the most trusted federal agency, 91% in the last Pew Research poll last week. Obviously also reflecting a new and great appreciation for what postal workers are doing during this crisis. But we've been servicing the people of this country on vote by mail and the information around balloting, voter registration, and so on for decades and decades. And the states that have mandatory vote by mail have absolutely no fraud. So that's just not true. And so if people are going to have true access to the ballot box, we're going to have vote by mail. and that's been really brought home in this tragic crisis. And if we don't have a United States public postal service, we will not be able to have vote by mail. And anybody that thinks voting can take place on the internet and take place safely, that's a pipe dream. The internet and all aspects can be easily hacked. Mail cannot be. So it's a great way. People are voting voluntarily that way long before this crisis in California.
And they don't have to pay when they're sending in their vote by mail, because we have a U.S. post office, unlike the private corporations.
That's right. It actually saves the cities, states, counties money. It works well. It increases voter participation. And just the opposite of thousands of people getting together and filling out each other's ballots, it actually gives people a chance to make a more informed vote, to think about it, but to have access to the ballot box. The last time I went to vote last November, it was a 3-hour wait at the polling place. And of course, our elections are on a work day. So it's much harder for working people to vote. So it's a thrust towards more democracy, defense of our democratic rights. And obviously, this pandemic has brought home that if we're going to have true access to the ballot box, or more access to the ballot box, because we really don't have true access now, vote by mail is definitely the way to go. It was before. Now it's very, very clear. And postal workers are ready to continue to serve the people of this country in all sorts of ways, including that defense of our democratic right to vote.
Mark Dimmonstein, I want to thank you for being with us, president of the American Postal Workers Union. We go from the post office to education in this country. Stay with us. That's Mariachi Nuevo Santander from Roma High School in Texas, virtually playing These Are These Eyes by Cuco Sanchez. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York. Juan Gonzalez is co-hosting from New Jersey. As we turn to the impact of the pandemic on schools, universities, students, parents, teachers, and professors here in New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, home to the largest school district in the United States, public schools have been closed since March 16th. At least 68 education department staffers have died from coronavirus, including 28 teachers, 25 teachers' assistants, also administrators, office workers, school aides, food service workers, guidance counselors, a parent coordinator, and a technology specialist. On Tuesday, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a new grading system for the rest of the coronavirus-disrupted school year and said some so-called underperforming students may be enrolled in virtual summer school. This is Mayor de Blasio.
We want to make sure the grading policy we use now fits the moment we're in now and the reality of our kids, our parents, our educators now. So the chancellor, his team worked with parents, teachers, elected officials, advocates, listened to all different viewpoints. We've had a series of conversations confirming the direction of this policy. And it came down to the notion of what we owe our kids at this moment. First of all, flexibility.
This comes as the Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school system in the U.S., has announced no student will receive an F grade. California Governor Gavin Newsom said the state's academic year could start in late July or early August, and some K-12 campuses may reopen to offer summer school programs. Meanwhile, here in New York, at least 12 and possibly as many as 17 faculty and staff in the public City University of New York system have died since the coronavirus pandemic began, including 5 at Brooklyn College. This This comes as universities nationwide face massive financial losses from closing down their campuses and moving instruction online during the pandemic. For more on all this, we're joined by education scholar Noliwe Brooks, the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Literature at Cornell University, where she's also Director of American Studies and a professor in Africana Studies. She's the author of Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education, joining us from her home in Ithaca, New York. She'll be the featured guest tonight at a virtual community conversation on the future of public schools in Queens after COVID-19. Professor Brooks, welcome to Democracy Now! What has the coronavirus pandemic exposed about education in America?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I think as we've seen in so many other areas, the pandemic is exposing, just shining a light on inequalities that are already there. As we see people who are impacted, who are falling ill, tend to be poor, tend to be Black, Latinx. The children who are suffering the most with this closing down of schools share similar kinds of demographics. One of the things that is perplexing, and hopefully we can come out of the other end of this, really taking this seriously, is we had absolutely no conversation. There were no emergency plans for closing of schools, for ceasing education. When it became clear that it was putting teachers and students, and as you mentioned, the numbers of educational workers who have lost their lives or fallen ill, attempting to stay in classrooms, we had no plans for what happens if you take schooling offline. We quickly, across the country, New York City and elsewhere, decided on remote education. There are two things about that are particularly disturbing. One, the fact that something as central to communities, as central to children, as central to vulnerable communities as public education. Public education is not just about education for vulnerable communities. It's also about healthcare. It's also about mental health. It's stability. It's about, for some kids, it's about where you get your clothes washed. It's about where you get the food you're going to eat during the day. To take something that central offline in a hodgepodge, in a rush, without even thinking that disaster preparation should account for what we do in the absence. The second thing is what we have put in place instead of in-person education is online schooling. What education scholars, it's just not even an open question anymore, know is online education advantages some children and severely disadvantages others. Communities that cannot have easy access to fast, to stable internet, it matters. The ways that those children are able to learn, to keep up, to have their learning abilities evaluated. You just can't do it as easily. A majority of poor Black and Latinx families access their internet through their phone. So there's additional charges that are racked up when they have to use their phones to try to access learning. We know that. We also know that in terms of standardized tests, in terms of closing gaps in educational learning, online learning consistently performs worse than any other delivery method. We know that from 20 years worth of research. It's not something new. So in this moment of crisis, which it was a crisis, something had to happen. Couldn't be planned for. That's what a disaster is. We both shut down schools in a way that further harmed certain kids, and we instituted a kind of learning that's going to cause an educational pandemic once these schools reopen.
Well, Professor Brooks, I wanted to ask you, at Rutgers University, one of my teams, I teach investigative reporting. I had one of my teams that's doing a project on the coronavirus, did a survey of several hundred Rutgers students precisely on this issue of remote teaching. And the figures they came up with were astounding. 85% of the students who responded to the survey said that that their ability to concentrate in the shift to online classes, 85% of them said was extremely affected or very much affected. And also 71% of them said that their home environment was very poor for being able to actually participate in the classes and online classes. So there is a huge, this is at the university level. Now take this down to the public school level, your sense of the impact that this is having even on the ability of students to learn.
Right. You know, we're seeing things like children who are sitting on a sidewalk in front of a McDonald's because there's stable Wi-Fi there. Looking for some Wi-Fi so that they can, in fact, complete the assignments. They want to learn. They want to keep up. They want to do well. But this form of education makes it difficult. Much like your students at Rutgers, I have students all across the socioeconomic spectrum in my classes. I have students who went back to homes that were housing insecure in New York City. In various family shelters where the Wi-Fi is spotty at best. I have students whose families became involved in ICE actions in the period between the declaration of the emergency and when they had to go home. And trying to navigate all of that. I now have students, you know, whose parents are unemployed, whose family members have died. So I know, as you do firsthand from a college perspective, how disruptive this is. It's not a leap to think, you know, students who were already at risk, who were already vulnerable, who were already, you know, in families worried about their ability to make ends meet. We now have an economic crisis on top of the public health crisis. And the ways that we're choosing to educate children is simply unequal and is going to lead to an educational crisis, an educational pandemic on the other side. You cannot ask students to perform well with a medium that requires a lot of concentration. You really have to pay attention, and you have to know how to make your computer work if it goes off. You have to know what to do if your Wi-Fi all of a sudden goes down in the midst of trying to learn new concepts, of trying to learn foundational knowledge that you're going to need to continue to move through the educational system. It is disruption on top of disruption on top of disruption for communities and children who can least afford it.
I'm also wondering if you've been following the experiment in Los Angeles. Unlike many of the other places around the country, in Los Angeles, the local public television station immediately switched to having different bands of its spectrum to provide instruction to different classes. I haven't heard this happening in many other places around the country, using public television, which is obviously accessible to many more people, to be able to get instruction out to students.
That's a great idea. And that is, no, I have not heard about that, and I had not been following it. I do know all over the country, though, you are seeing businesses, parents, activists, and families get together to talk about what would work best for them, what they think needs to happen. There have been some calls for allowing children to access the Wi-Fi in public schools. We can't have instruction take place in New York City public schools for a variety of reasons. But is it the case that children on school grounds could not access that Wi-Fi in order to have something stable? There are people who are asking for creativity in this moment. And certainly, as we think about what happens on the other side, we don't know when schools are going to open up again. We don't know what form. We don't know But we know that there's going to be an other side of this. And as we reach that other side, I'm hopeful that we do not repeat some of the unintentional mistakes that were made when we shut things down, where we did not ask school by school, neighborhood by neighborhood, what do you need from us? What is it that give them a seat at the table, give folks who are most impacted a seat at the table and say, just ask the question. How can we bring these schools back online in a way that does not disadvantage your children? What do you know that what we need to know? And I think we're at a point in the crisis where we need that kind of creativity and collaboration.
What about the mental health of young people right now who are at home, who, in a lot of cases, either they don't have access to screens or the parents didn't want them to. Now, of course, online all the time. And also this vision you have of the future. You have the president of Brown University saying if schools don't reopen in the fall, higher education is imperiled. Now, most kids go to public schools, whether we're talking about community colleges, whether we're talking about public universities. What about all of this, that we don't even know what's going to happen, and the inequitable, very different kind of endowments that the Ivy Leagues have versus the rest of higher education in this country? Are we going to see a closing of hundreds of schools?
Right. One of the things, the conversation about higher education is sort of mirroring the conversation that we're having about K-12, in that we're tending to, we're not, our public policy, our sense of urgency is not around children who are most in need, or institutions that are serving children who are most in need. The vast majority, well over 50%, well over 60% of Black and Latinx kids who get BAs, who get college degrees, do so at community colleges or for-profit universities, not at four-year institutions, and certainly not at schools like the one that I teach, in which I teach. But the conversation about reopening colleges and universities has so far excluded community colleges almost wholly. I'm hearing very little in the national media about what is the impact on community colleges, where most of these kids are actually being served. It's a similar phenomena that you're finding with K-12, where there's almost no conversation about the kind and the quality of instruction that's even taking place online based on the socioeconomic background of the kids. Some kids are having some of the plans entail them having limited, I'll give you 40 minutes a week, or 2 40-minute sessions a week that actually involve the computer. And the rest of the time, it's not even online, parents are being asked to step in, are being given different kinds of worksheets and plans, and they're being asked to step in and to help ensure that kids are completing this work. Parents have different abilities to offer that kind of help. So in both K-12 as well as in higher education, as is so often the case, our public policy is not starting from the bottom up. It's starting from the top down. It's starting with what works best in a time of crisis when we're all impacted. Well, it's still asking what works best for the most wealthy.
Well, of course, this is a conversation that we'll have to continue. Noliwe Rooks, we want to thank you for joining us, the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Literature at Cornell University, author of Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is working with as few people on site as possible. Majority of our amazing team is working from home. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez for another edition of Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. Stay safe.